As the year comes to an end, the countdown begins for athletes across the country with exciting racing plans circled on their calendars for 2026. While the holiday season represents a break from training for some, for others it's the perfect opportunity to start ramping up towards big goals in the year ahead. Regardless of where you find yourself, the end of one year and the beginning of the next makes a perfect time for all runners to take some time and look back on the accomplishments of the passing year and ahead towards races, training, and new opportunities in the year ahead. And while athletes will be obsessing over their Strava year-end stats and setting even loftier targets for fast times and high mileage in the year ahead, many might be overlooking an area for improvement that's equally ripe for the taking: their nutrition. This week on the Shakeout Podcast, we're joined by registered dietitian Sandra Kilmartin of No Sweat Nutrition. A multi-time All-American on the track while attending UBC Vancouver, and an accomplished track, road, and trail athlete herself, Sandra's joint passions for running and nutrition come together in her work helping athletes of all abilities, from the track to the ultramarathon, fuel better, feel better, and get the most out of themselves through real-world nutrition solutions. Today, Sandra joins the show to discuss some of the strategies all athletes can apply when looking ahead at their training and racing in 2026. We talk about steps runners can take to make sure they're giving their bodies the fuel they need to perform, how to avoid some of the common race day fueling pitfalls, and what it looks like to create a nutrition plan that works with you to achieve all your running goals. Sandra, welcome to the Shakeout Podcast. So excited to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, John. I'm stoked to be here.
Really looking forward to diving into planning out a great year ahead for all of our runners, regardless of what their goals are. It's an exciting time of year. We're coming to the end of the year. This will be the last episode of this show before we head into a New Year break. And I know many runners, both of us included, are already looking ahead at 2026, building out their calendars. I know you, as a trail and ultra athlete, have probably planned out your entire 2026 just because those race registrations fill up so quickly. So I think a great place to start and to ground this conversation is simply by asking, why should runners be taking the time to plan out a nutrition strategy alongside their training and their racing plan for the year ahead?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of runners, like you said, this is the perfect time to start focusing on nutrition for a few reasons. Usually training and, intensity and volume is maybe a little bit lower for some people this time of year. You might be taking a bit of a break or just ramping things up. So just purely with the extra, mental capacity and a bit of extra time this time of year, it's nice to start thinking about some things that maybe might be a bit harder to think about when you're traveling or training is really ramping up. I mean, especially our marathoners and ultra marathoners, when you're spending 6 hours in the mountains every Saturday and Sunday, you kind of don't really have a ton of time to think about other things like nutrition. So now is a perfect time to kind of lay a foundation, maybe think back to some of those races or training blocks from the year prior and think about what you can do differently. And then part of it too is just purely because, even though we're thinking about the race and wanting to maybe make an awesome race nutrition plan, we still have to get there. We have to get to the start line healthy, which means we have to get through a big training block. So, now is the best time to start supporting your training, because a lot of what you do on race day is from what you did the months prior to in training and nutrition. So that's why it's a great time.
It really does seem like the best guarantee of a great race is a great build towards that race. And you work all the time with athletes planning out not just the race day strategy for their goal race itself, but all of those weeks and months that lead into it. In your practice as a registered dietitian and sports nutrition coach, what are some of the big areas of improvement, I'll call them? I don't want to say mistakes that athletes are making, but what are some of the things that a lot of athletes come to you with oversights on when they're looking at that larger picture heading into their goal races?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, an athlete is going to approach me with time to look at that larger picture. I think one of the big things I see even before that is athletes reaching out 2 weeks, sometimes days before their A race of the year, which I totally get. You've kind of just been thinking about the training and just life in general, and you realize, oh shoot, I want to maybe work on nutrition now, or maybe someone said something to you. And so in general, I see, people overlooking the potential they have to work on their nutrition ahead of time. So that's one thing. But then, when I have people who reach out a few months before their race, which is just, the best time, a huge thing I see is just under fueling in general. Like rarely am I working with endurance athletes and runners who are, meeting their carb and calorie needs. So I see a lot of folks who are really focusing on protein. Protein's getting a huge moment, I guess, in social media and just media in general. In the next year, it'll probably be something else. But, when I look at athletes' intake in detail, lots of times they're meeting their protein needs. Sometimes they're even exceeding it, and they're really missing just overall calorie intake and carb intake for their training load. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is just kind of missing that nutrition planning piece. So, people might be looking at a race course and really thinking about how their training is going to line up with that. Is it hilly? Is it flat? But then kind of forgetting about that nutrition piece. Like, what's the actual plan for race day? Are you looking up what the race is offering? Is that what you're going to use in terms of nutrition? Or they just, think that they're going to nail their nutrition plan on race day because that's when it counts, but they don't fuel their training, which, has some issues in and of itself, just not even fueling enough, but then also that's just a recipe for GI distress on race day. So that's another one I see is just kind of overlooking that lead up time and not fueling enough.
It seems to me like a similar mistake to that old adage of nothing new on race day. You would never wear a brand new pair of shoes for the first time on a race, and yet so many athletes go into these really long, really intense races and just assume that whatever they find at hand to eat is probably going to be good, and that's not the case. And I want to spend some time later on in our conversation talking about making a really great race day plan so that an athlete can nail their goals on the day. But before we get to that, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about that underfueling piece that you mentioned. And my question to you, Sandy, is what do you think goes into the mindset of all of these athletes who come to you and are underfueling? Are most of them surprised to learn that they're underfueling? And maybe a follow-up to that would be, what are the cultural or scientific or sociological elements that are leading to these athletes overlooking such an important piece of the broader training mixture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I think to answer your first part, I probably get, maybe two camps of people if I really, kind of divide them that way. I get some people who come to me and they know that nutrition is something they need to work on, because they're maybe, not training isn't going well, they're not sleeping, maybe they're getting recurring injuries, illness, and whether they've heard from maybe another healthcare professional that they need to look into fueling, or they've just learned themselves, they kind of know that nutrition is the piece they're missing, and then that's great too, because then we can just kind of work on that and they're motivated and ready to make a change. But then, yeah, a lot of athletes I see, endurance athletes especially, they don't realize they're underfueling and they are surprised. And I think that's for a few reasons. Like, endurance athletes are so used to such a high level of training. So we say things like, oh, I just had a 2 hour long run. I only had 12K today. And really that's a long time. Like, we burn anywhere from a 12K run could be anywhere from 500 to 700 calories. And when I tell people, that's a whole nother big meal or two substantial snacks, what are you doing to adjust your nutrition on a day where you have a 12K run and a day where you don't? And I think when you put it that way, people do get a bit surprised just because, like I said, we're kind of immune to the level of training we do. And then when you get into the ultra world, it's even more nonchalant. I only had 4 hours this Sunday. And it's just, it's so funny. So we don't really realize how much energy goes into that.
On this topic of not really understanding how much energy we're exerting as endurance athletes, do you think there's just a general undervaluation of how much of the fatigue we might be feeling day to day is a result of not fueling properly? So often we feel tired or maybe sluggish, and we just assume that that's normal because we're training relatively hard. Is it normal? Or for a lot of athletes, could it be that they're not getting enough nutrition and they could actually feel a lot better day to day?
Totally. Yeah, you really nailed it there. I think sometimes people run into the issue of feeling good in the actual training session. So, maybe they only had a couple gels for a really, really long run and they felt good. They didn't bonk, they hit their paces, whatever. But they don't really realize how maybe that fueling in that session or before the session, even the night before, can really trickle down and affect the way they feel after. So, I mean, aside from maybe some really, really long days out in the mountains, like you shouldn't be completely like after your long run, it shouldn't be a write-off. Like, you might be feeling not super 100%, but you shouldn't have to spend the whole day on the couch. Like you should be able to get your work done or, play with your kids or do some errands. So I think just that, in general, we are a bit more tired from training, but there becomes a line you cross where you shouldn't be, like I said, writing off the whole rest of the day or feeling too tired to, yeah, do things you love. And, yeah, and I think part of it too is that athletes are just notoriously bad at like estimating how much, fuel they need, but that's also because athletes aren't dietitians. I mean, we all eat, but we don't all necessarily study and understand the science of eating and exercise. And we can learn some things for sure, but it's no fault of the athlete. We know from research that when athletes don't have nutrition education, yeah, they notoriously don't match their intake with their expenditure. But then after they get some nutrition education, they can learn and be pretty good at it. So yeah, I think that's the other piece too, for sure.
I want to take a sidebar for a second here. And what you've just talked about is something that I think is important for us to delve a little bit more into, and that is the role of a registered dietitian and a sport nutrition coach on top of that, like you are. Could you explain to our listeners what it is that differentiates an RD like yourself from the plethora of nutrition specialists or nutrition influencers that we might see online?
Yeah, totally. I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people that I run into don't really know the difference between a registered dietitian and a nutritionist, at least in Canada. Registered dietitian is a protected term. No one can call themselves a registered dietitian unless they've undergone a specific level of training and education. Whereas you could call yourself a nutritionist tomorrow. That's not to say that there's not great nutritionists out there sharing awesome, sports nutrition information. It's not to say you can't ever work with a nutritionist, but you don't really know what you're getting. And you'd have to maybe delve into someone's credentials a little bit more to make sure that, you're getting someone who knows what they're talking about. Whereas a registered dietitian, you know that they've had at minimum a bachelor's degree, a certain amount of hours of practicum and practical training. There are certain higher risk activities that dietitians can do in terms of hospital work and things like that. Um, yeah, so it's something that I always like to tell people. Like I said, nothing wrong with a nutritionist per se. They could have a bachelor degree and have a really good foundation for nutrition education, but they also could have a 2-week course and be trying to sell you something. Dietitians, we have a code of ethics, so there's certain things we can't do. We actually can't even share client testimonials after from one-on-one work. We can share testimonials from maybe a product that we've made that might be helpful or a book or something, but yeah, we can't even legally share those because we're not supposed to skew the public into accessing our care because it is healthcare. Um, and on top of that, that's also why typically registered dietitians are covered under extended health. That being said, there is some confusion even amongst extended health companies themselves who will cover more money for nutritionists than dietitians. So that's something we're always trying to advocate for. But yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because it's important to know.
It does bring to mind to me just how much information there is out there for all people, particularly athletes, to wade through when they're looking to address something that is as multifaceted and at times confusing as their nutrition. You've already touched on this, but they might know that something needs to change, but just beginning that process of finding out where to start and what needs to change is really daunting. And it seems to me like that's where an RD can really play a big role. Have you noticed, coming back to the idea of these long-term plans working with athletes, what have been some of the misconceptions that athletes have about their own nutrition? You've already touched on kind of this overemphasis on protein or an underemphasis on just general fueling. Are there any others that come to mind that you see a lot in your practice working with athletes?
Totally, yeah. I think athletes really forget how much of some messaging doesn't apply to them. So whether that be just general nutrition advice for the public or, diet culture messaging, but I even have like a series on my Instagram that I did where it's general population nutrition advice that does not apply to athletes. And that's because there's so many things that just doesn't apply for people who are doing the amount of training we're doing. It might work for someone who's, working in an office and, maybe doing a couple fitness classes a week. But yeah, I think part of that is huge, just not understanding how their needs differ and getting advice that's reputable advice. Like Health Canada gives advice for most Canadians, but athletes just need to understand that doesn't apply to you. You don't need to worry as much about added sodium and added sugar. Added sugar won't give you diabetes because your level of activity makes you very insulin sensitive and things like that. So it's just taking advice that actually might even be reputable, but it doesn't apply to your situation, which is why working with a dietitian can be huge, because it's individualized advice. Like, we take into account your medical history, your training load, your goals. Um, and then the second note I mentioned about the diet culture, I think that's huge too. Like, certain things people just consume out there on social media, like you shouldn't drink your calories, or if you're hungry, maybe just have a glass of water. And I'm like, no, if you are hungry and you're a runner, you need to eat. Sometimes you need to eat actually even when you're not hungry. So even principles like intuitive eating, which are really great principles, and dietitians even teach them, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. When you're an endurance athlete, sometimes we need to eat to a schedule, and sometimes we need to have a bunch of liquid calories after a training session because we're not hungry, but we know we need that recovery. So it's really confusing. Even just me talking about it, I feel like I'm going in circles because there's so much out there on nutrition, and that's where dietitians can really cut through that noise and help you, make you feel like nutrition shouldn't be a separate full-time job.
Cutting through that noise is, I think, a really important point that you bring up. And recognizing as athletes that healthy eating exists on a spectrum that's not binary. There's no perfectly right and perfectly wrong way to fuel our bodies. And that's certainly been my experience. I think anytime that I've ascribed to a do or die mentality with any part of my diet, it just has ended up setting me up for failure because I become bound by these hard and fast rules that aren't actually serving me. Something that you mentioned that I want to spend a little bit of time on, it came up by way of talking about those liquid calories, but you talk about gut distress, and I think every listener on this show, anybody who's run any sort of distance, will be able to empathize with the fact that sometimes you do finish a run and the last thing you want to do, no matter how hard that run was, no matter how many calories you burned, is eat a big meal and replenish what you've just lost. How do you address that as a dietitian? Because surely that must come up with athletes that you work with, and even in your own training. I mean, you're an ultramarathoner yourself. What are some of the tips that you can give us to deal with the gut distress coming out of those longer sessions when we know we really do need to eat something, but the idea of sitting down to a big steak and potatoes meal, so to speak, is about the last thing on our minds?
Totally. Yeah, I can empathize with that so much, especially when the intensity goes up, when the heat comes in the summer. It's just the last thing you want to do, like you said. And yeah, you brought up the main thing we moved to is, can we get some liquid calories in? So, and this goes far beyond just water and a protein shake. So this is something I see a lot of athletes do. They're doing a really good job at getting a protein shake in after their training, which is like awesome. You've already got the habit down. You're halfway there, but we want to get some carbs in there too. So just kind of depends what you can tolerate. Like, what do people like? If they like, chocolate milk, that's a great option. If they're not doing dairy, sometimes we do a chocolate soy milk. This time of year, it could be eggnog or hot chocolate. So yeah, just really trying to get in those liquid calories. Maybe it's even something like a smoothie. It could just be so much easier to get in the door and drink something, and then let your gut warm up a bit and have that meal 1 to 2 hours after the run. Um, and with that too, sometimes we'll look at the run nutrition itself. So sometimes we fuel on a run, not even necessarily for what we're going to be doing on that run, but maybe we know we're going to have a period of time after that run where we can't get something in, like if we do struggle getting something in, or we have errands to run, maybe you're fueling a bit more per hour on the run or closer to the end of the run. Like, if you're finishing and you have a couple gels left that you packed, but you don't actually need because you're 15 minutes from home, if you actually, get those in, that can buy you a bit of time to let your stomach settle, or, do those physio exercises that you're always putting off, and things like that. So kind of depends on the athlete and what works for their preferences and their lifestyle. But liquid calories can be a huge game changer. It can be as simple as like a can of ginger ale. Like getting those carbs in post workout is so important.
I think that will come as a shock to many athletes. And I hope that we would be able to delve into this. And so thank you for opening the door to that. You've just listed chocolate milk, you've listed hot chocolate, eggnog, ginger ale. None of those scream health drink to the health minded online influencer or even to many of the general population. You talked about getting the calories in. Are there specific types of calories that we really want to prioritize in those 30 minutes or so immediately after, or even during the latter stages of longer endurance activity that drinks like the ones you just mentioned provide a ready source of?
Yeah, totally. I mean, in an ideal world, if an athlete can have their post-workout nutrition dialed, we want to get carbs and protein and some fluid. Those three things are going to do different things for the body. The carbs are going to replenish your glycogen stores or your carbohydrate stores that you've burned through in a hard or long effort, and it's going to kickstart your recovery. Protein is going to help repair your muscles, and then obviously we want to rehydrate with some fluids. But I, like I said before, I find athletes really overemphasize the protein and they're getting in that protein shake, which is great. But I say if you actually had to choose, we don't want to put any sort of macronutrient like carbs, protein, or fat as more important than the other because we need them all. But if I had to choose, I would say get those carbs in because we know, especially if you're doing double sessions or you have an evening session and a session the next morning. So when we have these short recovery windows, we want to get carbs in as soon as possible, like within 30 minutes max, but ideally right after the session. And sometimes it can be a lot easier to just have some juice or some more sports drink, or like I said, maybe some pop or something, rather than thinking about getting in a smoothie or a protein shake. But if you can do carbs and protein, great. But if not, I say prioritize carbs and then get in your protein within an hour or two. Like get your meal in. Your body repairs that muscle that you've broken down. It uses all the protein in your meals and snacks for a couple days after the activity, whereas carbs, we really want to optimize that post recovery window. So yeah, carbs if I had to choose, but it's all important.
I love that you're breaking it down into steps that are really accessible to busy people, recognizing most of our listeners, both of us, we're fitting training in around all of these other things. And you don't have to have this guilt ascribed to reaching for a chocolate milk or a can of ginger ale, knowing that as an athlete, that's exactly what your body needs in those moments after finishing a workout to not only recover, but like you say, to build back and be ready for that next session. As so many of our listeners will know, you're getting in the runs after work and you're going again the next morning before work or before a kid's soccer practice, and making sure that you have the energy to carry you between sessions is just as important as having the fueling during those sessions, it seems to me at least. It brings me to a topic that I wanted to dive into more with you, and that's training availability. It's something that you've talked about in your practice and in the social media content that you've put out, which has been great. It's been very informative to me personally, and I know to many other athletes that follow what No Sweat Nutrition is doing. What does training availability mean, and how does it relate to this idea of making sure that we're fueling between sessions so that we're ready to go for whatever's coming down the pipe?
Yeah, training availability is basically how it sounds. It's how available an athlete is to train. So if you have a high training availability, that means you're typically able to do the training that's prescribed. You're having consistent back-to-back sessions and weeks that aren't being intercepted by illness or injury, or potentially even maybe just some low motivation from underfueling. So training availability is super important. Nutrition is a factor that can affect your training availability. Of course, sleep and other things can affect that, but nutrition is huge. And especially this time of year, we're right in the middle of flu season. And again, nutrition is one of many factors that can affect your immune system. And so, yeah, working on nutrition is going to help optimize your training availability, which we all know is so important to have a good race performance is consistent training. So anytime you can work on nutrition and for immune health, um, a lot of people think about certain vitamins and minerals that are really important for immune health, like vitamin C or zinc, which yes, are super important. But really the foundation of good immune system nutrition is eating enough calories. So it's eating enough first, and then carbs also play an important role in immune function. And then, of course, those vitamins and minerals on top of that, and hydration. Yeah, so that's super important for training availability as well.
Goes into the mix. I love that you bring out that especially acute sense of trying to stay healthy during this holiday season. I think every runner has experienced a holiday break that's been anything but a break. Maybe they're training extra hard because they've got a few extra days off of work and they're trying to fit it in on top of this busy social calendar. They're staying out later, they're maybe having a couple extra drinks here and there. What are some of the things from a diet forward point of view? You talked about supplements, but from a fueling with real food perspective that we can be doing over the holiday season to help prevent against that pitfall of getting sick? The last thing anybody wants, and it happens to so many of us, is to start the new year sick as a dog because we've been trying to burn the candle at both ends with our training goals and all of our social and family commitments. How can we be using food to bulletproof ourselves against some of those downfalls?
hmm Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, the big thing, I always talk about like a sports nutrition pyramid. So if we are talking about the base of the pyramid, that's the thing that you really want to focus more of your time and energy on. The base of our pyramid is we want to be eating enough. So just overall enough calories. We know that's important. But then when we put that aside, let's say you're eating enough calories, we really still want to focus on timing. So, when we look at research on athletes, even if they eat enough calories in the day and they're getting enough carbs, protein, fat, they're really nailing all the numbers at the end of the day. If we see these big gaps in the day without nutrition, so I'm thinking over the holidays, you're out of your routine. You might be, doing a bunch of errands after a run, and before you know it, there's 2 hours have gone by, and like I said, you haven't got your recovery nutrition in, or dinner is at so and so's house and they eat at 7 p.m. and you're used to eating at 5. Trying to think about your nutrition in terms of the plan for the day because timing is really important. So, yeah, when we look at the research on athletes who meet their energy needs, if they have these gaps in the day, 4 or 5 hours without eating, even if they make up for it later, which is what we call backloading, um, we still see detrimental health and performance effects, which is really interesting. Like I said, a non-active person, a non-athlete might get away with maybe skipping breakfast or having a big gap between lunch and dinner, but athletes, our brain just does not like that. Our brain really wants this consistent nutrition. So we want to eat enough. We want to focus on the timing. Um, and then we want to look at enough of the right things. So again, if you're eating enough protein and fat and calories, but you're under eating carbs, again, we see the same thing in the research. We see implications for immunity, bone health. It actually affects iron absorption, just energy. It can accelerate the development of something we call REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, which is just a fancy term for the health and performance outcomes of not eating enough. Carbs play a specific role in that. So I would say this holiday season, take advantage of the extra carbs, especially if your training is high. Of course, if your training's lower and you're taking some time off, you need a little bit less than before, but you still need carbs. Your brain still needs carbs, and your muscles. And so take advantage. If your training load's higher and you're fitting in some longer runs because you have time off work, have those post-workout cookies, cookies and eggnog. It's like a great post-workout snack. Take advantage of those yams and potatoes and buns and think about your filling up your athlete plate with more carbs if your training is higher because they'll probably be widely available this time of year.
Heading into a season of feasting for many of our listeners, this is probably music to many people's ears, certainly to mine. You talk about that base level of the pyramid, really the foundation of the nutrition period. And we stand here at the start of a new year, the end of one year, really, but looking ahead now for most people towards 2026 goals. How can we make sure that we're laying a really strong foundation, both in terms of our nutrition foundation, but also creating a really robust fueling strategy that's going to carry us through two big goals in the year ahead? What's a great starting point for our listeners if they want to make this the year that they really up their nutrition and fueling strategy and game?
Yeah, I think like any, New Year's resolution or just goal setting session is really thinking back to, yeah, like I said, some of the races or training blocks that you've had in 2025 and see what went right and see what maybe could use some improvement. Reflect back. Did you DNF a race because you were bonking? Did you have really bad cramping in the last 10K? Was there maybe some GI distress? What was maybe an area that you could improve on? And even races aside, like I said, the training. Did you have some blocks of training where you missed a lot or didn't feel very motivated or weren't hitting paces? Of course, some of these things can be non-nutrition related, but there is a lot of potential to hone in on the nutrition and give yourself the best chance. So I would say look back, reflect, and maybe you can figure out some troubleshooting yourself. But then, now's a great time to reach out to a sports dietitian and really just build those habits that can carry you through the rest of the racing season. January is a good time too because a lot of people's extended health rolls over and you might have a few $100s to, work with a registered dietitian on things. So why not? Give yourself enough time to trial some things, maybe get some investigations going, things like GI distress or low iron and things like that. That takes time to correct, and no matter what some supplement company will tell you, some of these fixes cannot happen overnight. And so that's why it's good to just start now and reflect on the past year.
The quicker you get going, the quicker those results come, even if they aren't overnight. What would it look like to work with a dietitian? They are registered province to province, so you've got to find one, correct me if I'm wrong, local to where you are. But what does that journey look like for an athlete in particular, somebody who's looking to get some expert guidance as it pertains to their training and racing goals?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this because I think as a dietitian, I obviously know exactly what I do day to day, but I think a lot of people don't know. They're either afraid about working with a registered dietitian. I have a lot of clients who were worried that I was going to tell them that they couldn't eat their favorite foods or I was going to be the food police. Or on the other hand, I have people who didn't even realize that a dietitian could help them with their marathon race plan or their lead up to the marathon or an ultra. Like we do everyday healthy nutrition to help you feel energized for training. And we also do performance nutrition and help you, develop a race plan that's backed by science that's individualized for you. So how that looks, like I said, if you reach out ahead of time, ideally, we're going to start from the basics. We would typically have a session where we can ask a lot of questions about you because we want to give individualized nutrition advice. There's no cookie cutter plans. Talk about your health history. What are your goals? What nutrition issues are you experiencing? Do you have any food preferences or allergies and things like that? And then, yeah, we'll usually talk about your foundation. What are you eating day to day that actually fuels your training and life? And then we set some goals together and then we book a follow-up and revisit those goals and then we can start working on other things. So maybe the day-to-day nutrition is looking good and we start looking at during run fueling. Maybe we're really focusing on hydration or electrolytes because that's the issue you ran into in your last race. So it's very athlete centered. We want to work on what you want as an athlete, but we also definitely want to cover the basics and make sure we start at the day-to-day nutrition. Of course, if you do reach out in a panic close to a race, we still can help. I don't turn people away. I try and help as much as I can and then say, let's get you back in after the race. That's another area that I see people kind of lacking is working with someone up until the race and then not really booking that next call to debrief and find out what went well, what can we improve on next time. So yeah, it's every session is different and like I said, it's client centered, but we try and guide people in the way of what we think would help them meet their goals.
Are there any big misconceptions that you find yourself having to correct with first time clients coming to you about? You talk about being the food police, and that was a fear of mine when I first started working with a sports dietitian. I've had great expert advice for a big portion of my career, but prior to that, I was scared to approach sports nutrition and working with a dietitian because I thought that I was going to be subjecting myself to judgment. Is that something that happens a lot in your practice?
Yeah, definitely. I think people are nervous and they don't know what to expect. I offer also 15-minute free calls just to get to know each other, see if we'd be a good fit. People can ask, what does it look like? What can I expect? I can speak for most dietitians in that our emails and DMs are open too. So if you're not sure if it's right for you, a lot of us offer free calls or you can just message and ask what it would look like. but we're definitely not the food police. We want to work with you and just help you achieve your goals. I'm cheering right alongside, just like your coach or your trainer. We just want the best for our athletes.
An important piece of the performance puzzle that I think every athlete should take some serious time to consider over this holiday season, and hopefully start the year off with a great plan in place to reach those big goals and fuel themselves towards those. Sandra, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today to share some of your expertise. All the best of luck with your own racing goals. I know you've got a busy calendar in the new year ahead. I'm personally looking forward to applying some of what I've learned today into my own training, and I know many of our listeners will be as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today and share everything that you've learned during your career as a registered dietitian and a phenomenal athlete in your own right.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for the platform to share what I love talking about.
It's been a pleasure. Another huge thanks to Sandra for joining us this week to share her expert advice on sports nutrition. Sandra is a registered dietitian and holds a diploma in sports nutrition from the International Olympic Committee. You can find out more helpful resources and next steps for your own nutrition journey by visiting nosweatnutrition.ca and following them at nosweatnutrition on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Shakeout Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you find your podcasts so you never miss an episode. That's it for this week and our final episode of 2025. I'm your host, John Gay, saying thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2026 to kick off another exciting year of running news, stories, and action from the Shakeout Podcast.